welcome to All Things 16th Century Women by Talking Tudors. My name is James Taffe, and this lecture, Ladies-In-Lament, will examine the role played by ladies and gentlewomen in mourning the 6 wives of Henry VIII. It will ask who they were, how they were appointed, what they wore, and what part they played by keeping vigil, riding in procession, and attending the funeral services of these royal women. It also distinguishes between their public and private mourning, before considering finally how these ladies and gentlewomen memorialized their mistress after her death. If we may begin by asking, who was appointed to attend the funerals of Henry VIII's wives, and why were they appointed? Henry's first queen, Catherine of Aragon, died at Kimbolton on the 7th of January 1536, and within a few days, preparations were made for her funeral, drafted by Thomas Risley. A few of these documents have survived, one of which, entitled A Remembrance for the Interment of the Right Excellent and Noble Princess the Lady Catherine, listed all the necessary provisions for the ceremony. More specifically, it asks, what and how many women shall be appointed to be principal mourners at Catherine's funeral? It was also recommended that letters of summons be written and sent to all those who were required to attend. On the 10th of January, Henry VIII wrote to Grace, Lady Bedingfield, the wife of Sir Edmund Bedingfield, who the king had entrusted to remain with the Queen at Kimbolton Castle. Henry informs her that he intends for Catherine's body to be buried at Peterborough, according to her honour and estate as Princess Dowager. As the king wrote in his letter of summons, "You shall understand that we have appointed you to be there as one of the principal mourners, and so to attend upon the said corpse till the same shall be buried, and the ceremonies finished." Other letters of summons have not survived, but we know that a Lady St. John had also been chosen to mourn Catherine, alongside Lady Bedingfield, as her husband John wrote to Cromwell on her behalf. He petitioned Cromwell to obtain the king's pardon to excuse the Lady St. John from this duty, for she was lately sick of breeding of young bones, or in other words, that his wife was suffering from an illness related to her recent pregnancy. He also advised that, as he was himself in the service of Catherine's daughter, Princess Mary, all such horses and servants that his wife should be furnished with for the occasion remained with him. A few lists have survived identifying the ladies and gentlewomen who were in attendance at the funerals of Henry VIII's wives, and a brief analysis suggests that these women can be categorized into at least 3 groups. Firstly, royal and/or noble women were appointed to attend. Drawn from the upper ranks of English nobility, many of these women were chosen specifically for their status. Noble and genteel women honored the dead with their presence by attending to pay their respects and pray for their souls. As the king acknowledged in his letter to Lady Bedingfield, for such an occasion, it was requisite to have the presence of a good many ladies of honour. Traditionally, the principal mourners at a funeral were to be of the same sex, but of a lesser social status than the deceased. It is important to note that Catherine of Aragon was buried as Princess Dowager, Jane Seymour as Queen Consort, Anne of Cleves as the king's sister, and Catherine Parr as Queen Dowager. Some ladies accompanied their husbands, who were themselves appointed to attend. These women may have, but did not necessarily know the Queen personally, unlike the ladies and gentlewomen of their households who had served them. Much of the rest of the funeral cortege of a queen, princess or dowager, was made up of their household servants, irrespective of their status. Their attendance at this occasion reflects the intimacy of their relationship as mistress and servant. This familiar bond was special and held in high regard. It was fitting that these women would attend to fulfill this last act of service. Often in accounts describing the funeral ceremonies of Henry's wives, no such distinction was made between these 2 groups, women of nobility and women of the household. Indeed, often they overlapped, as many noble ladies served in the households of queens. Here in the account of Jane Seymour's funeral, leading the procession is Princess Mary, as chief mourner, followed by 7 noble ladies, identified as ladies of honour. These women rode in front on horseback behind the first chariot carrying the corpse. Successively, ladies and gentlewomen went in procession, in order of precedence, according to a strict social hierarchy. Among the noble ladies were Eleanor, Countess of Rutland, and Mary, Countess of Sussex, both of whom served Jane in her privy chamber. Riding in the 4th chariot were Mary Zouche, Elizabeth Holland, Jane Ashley, Mary Norris, and Anne Parr, all of whom served the late Queen as her maids of honour. And in the 5th chariot we can identify 2 maids, Elizabeth Oxenbridge and Anne Bassett, and 3 of the Queen's Chamberers, Dorothy Fitzherbert, Elizabeth Rastall, and Anne Jocelyn. There was a third group of women, often forgotten: the unnamed female servants who were retained by the other women in attendance. For Jane's funeral, it is briefly acknowledged that all other gentlewomen waiters and chamberers were commanded to ride afore to Windsor to prepare them to attend of their ladies and mistresses. These women were not in the procession itself, and thus their names are unaccounted for. There were also a great number of unnamed poor women who took part in this solemn procession, who received alms and black cloth for the occasion. Having been appointed, all of these women had to ensure that they were properly attired for the occasion. As Henry remarked to Lady Bedingfield, "I desire and pray you to put yourself in a readiness, so to attend upon the said corpse." Preparations for Catherine of Aragon's funeral specified that black cloth must be provided for some 30 ladies and gentlewomen, to dress each of them after her estate and degree, as well as to furnish their servants, horses, and their chariots. Henry assured Lady Bedingfield that he would provide yards of black cloth sufficient to attire both herself and her own servants. She had to arrange for a silkwoman to make up the mourning livery as required. These garments could take some time to produce. The mourning livery for Catherine's ladies was completed on the 26th of January, nearly 3 weeks after her death. All women in attendance at court wore plain clothes until their mourning garments were ready. The clothes worn by Elizabeth of York's women during this time were described as such most sad and simplest clothing that they had on their heads, with kerchiefs hanging on their shoulders and close under their chins. Shortly after Jane Seymour's death in 1537, it was observed that all ladies and gentlewomen put apart their rich apparel, and put on their mourning habit and white kerchiefs hanging on their heads and shoulders. Mourning clothes for noble ladies and genteel women consisted of a hood, a mantle, a cassock, and a surcoat worn under the mantle. The amount and quality of the fabric which mourners could use was regulated strictly by the College of Arms, according to the wearer's role and status. A set of ordinances prescribed what was appropriate mourning attire, distinguishing between servants in the hierarchy of the household. Before the body of the late queen, dowager, or princess could be buried, it lay in state while her servants kept vigil. The body itself had to be prepared for burial. A remembrance for the interment of Catherine of Aragon prescribed that, firstly, the corpse must be seared, tremailed, leaded, and chested with spices and other things thereunto appertaining. Catherine's body would be embalmed, wrapped, and then enclosed in a coffin or chest. In the meantime, she lay in her privy chamber, placed under the canopy of state, where it reportedly rested for 7 days without any solemnity than 4 torches continually burning. Once Catherine's body was prepared and placed in a coffin, it was carried from her chamber to the chapel in a solemn fashion, accompanied by 8 ladies who were there to attend the vigils of the dead. In the days after her death, on the 24th of October 1537, Jane's body too had been laying in state, resting in her presence chamber before being conveyed to the adjoining chapel. There her ladies and gentlewomen as chief mourners knelt upon the hearse, according to their degrees. As part of the vigil, these women, alongside the late Queen's gentlemen ushers, the officers of arms, and others appointed, were responsible for keeping watch over the body of their mistress until the day of the burial. The watch was kept up even through the night, and by morning the watch was relieved, with certain ladies and gentlewomen who it was observed had continually knelt about the corpse, then departed to their breakfast provided for them. The public procession of the royal corpse to its place of burial was an important part of the funeral ceremony. Whereas lying in state and church services were attended by a privileged few, the procession was the only stage where the majority of spectators could actually observe and mark the occasion for themselves, and this would have had an impact on its contemporaries, visually, materially, and perhaps emotionally. Jane Seymour's body was conveyed from Hampton Court to Windsor on the 12th of November 1537 for its burial. On this day the funeral cortege set off in procession. Prepared as afore, rehearsed every man and woman commanded to horseback and to proceed in order after their degrees. The chronicler, Charles Risley, described the procession briefly, observing that there was a great multitude of lords and gentlemen riding all in black gowns and coats, the Lady Mary, the king's daughter, being chief mourner, with a great company of ladies and gentlewomen waiting on her, and riding all in black. The manuscript account of Jane's funeral procession lists the attendees by name, and even sketches out a sort of plan view. Here you can see the corpse on the hearse, surrounded by banners and flanked on either side with gentlemen. and then immediately following the hearse are listed in order of precedence the ladies in their chariots and riding on horseback in procession. Anne of Cleves' funeral procession is also described in rich detail, and there even survives an accompanying near-contemporary sketch of the procession. On the 3rd of August 1557, the day before Anne's funeral, a grand procession set out from Chelsea, retrieving the corpse, and headed towards Westminster Abbey. The corpse of Lady Anne was transported on a hearse, with men and women in front, behind, and at either side of her. As illustrated in this sketch, there were many gentlemen on horseback, some of the nobility, others conducting the procession. Her chamberlain, steward, and gentlemen ushers, all dressed in black coats and gowns, carrying staffs or rods symbolic of their office. Other men in procession bearing a number of torches. Many children of the chapel, priests, and monks. And of course, ladies and gentlewomen, both noble ladies as Anne's principal mourners, and her own household servants. Not all of the women who we know attended Anne's funeral can be identified in this sketch by their order in the procession, as the artist appears to have made a more general interpretation, though there are a few exceptions. The lady on horseback on the left here is surely meant to represent Elizabeth Paulet, Marquess of Winchester and wife of William Paulet. Behind her and carrying her train was Elizabeth, Lady Mordaunt, the wife of Sir John Mordaunt. At the head of the hearse, there were prepared seats with cushions covered with black cloth specifically for Lady Elizabeth Stafford, the old Duchess of Norfolk. At their arrival, the hearse was set within the abbey, and the next day, 9 noble ladies, the principal mourners, were to be at the church by 7 o'clock in the morning to attend the first masses for the funeral service. Anne's ladies and gentlewomen, having their hoods on their heads, arrived at the west door, where they lit their torches, proceeded to the hearse, and took their places accordingly. And thus finally came the day of the funeral service itself. At Anne's funeral, noble ladies and gentlewomen mourners attended Mass before making an offering. For the first Mass, a gentleman usher laid out black cloth and cushions for Elizabeth, Marquess of Winchester, who went up and offered a piece of gold, with none to offer but she. This offering was repeated once more for a second Mass. At the third and final Mass, the chief mourner again offered a piece of gold and so returned and took her place. Before then the rest of the ladies, 2 by 2 and in turn, rose up and went to the offering. After the offering of money was the offering of pawls. The ladies again rose up, and at the head of the hearse, they each received upon her arms 1 pall of cloth of gold, which she brought to the foot of the hearse, and delivered to 2 heralds, who with kissing their hands received it, and laid it on the feet of the corpse. When the ceremony had ended, all of the ladies and gentlewomen mourners departed, and then began the burial. Once the coffin was buried, the chief officers of her household, her Lord Chamberlain, Lord Steward, did break their staffs, and her gentlemen ushers broke their rods, and they all cast them into her tomb, symbolically representing the end of their service to their mistress. Although there can be no doubt that the funeral ceremonies of these royal women were sad, somber occasions, it is difficult to gauge the emotions of the ladies and gentlewomen in attendance. Funeral decorum and discipline may have contained personal or spontaneous expressions of sorrow. A state of mourning was, often quite purposefully, reflected in more subtle alterations in routine, speech, gestures, and demeanour. Such ceremonies may have constituted emotions which were not necessarily felt so much as they were performed, severing the participants, or actors, from the sentiments they conveyed. On the other hand, deviations from prescribed ritual may betray feelings which were unprompted, and potentially more real. During a watch for the vigil for Anne of Cleves, it was observed that the next shift would be taken by 4 gentlemen and 8 yeomen, but no gentlewomen, for on this occasion, that they were not well at ease, to watch the corpse all night. Did this mean that they were felt to be too struck with grief to fulfill this office? Other reports focused their attentions on the king. The chronicler Edward Hall remarked briefly of the lamentation felt by all after the death of Queen Jane Seymour, though of none in the realm was it taken more heavily than of the King's Majesty himself. Jane's death caused the king immediately to remove into Westminster, where he mourned and kept himself close and secret for a while. Hall also observed that Henry remained in his mourning apparel for Christmas at Greenwich, as did all the court, suggesting that the monarch set the tone for other men and women near or about him. Certainly the women and the men who served in the households of royal and noble ladies would have had the opportunity to interact with their mistress and develop emotional bonds. and thus could have been quite struck with grief upon her death. The anonymous and often imaginative Spanish chronicle remarked briefly that at the burial of Catherine of Aragon, the lamentations of the servants were truly pitiable. In a Latin epigraph on Catherine Parr, John Parkhurst, her chaplain, wrote on behalf of the Dowager Queen's servants upon the death of their most gentle mistress. For the departed, we her household flow with watery eyes. Damp is the British earth from moistened cheeks. Bitter grief consumes us, we unhappy ones. But she rejoices midst the heavenly host. This outpouring of emotion from servants of Henry VIII's wives is most striking in those grieving for their mistress who was to be executed. Neither Anne Boleyn nor Catherine Howard had a funeral, and both queens were buried with little honour or ceremony in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the walls of the Tower of London and close to the place of their execution. This does not mean, however, that their tragic end was not mourned by those who knew and served them. Lancelot de Caux, secretary to the French ambassador residing in England, wrote that, on the scaffold, moments before Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536, her ladies were half dead themselves, describing them as bereft of their souls, such was their weakness. Mere moments before death, the Queen consoled her ladies several times, as one of them in tears came forward to do the last office and cover her face with a linen cloth. Another eyewitness to Anne's execution observed that her ladies then withdrew themselves some little space and knelt down against the scaffold, bewailing bitterly and shedding many tears. Immediately after her head was stricken off with a sword, it was taken up by one of her ladies and covered with a white cloth, while the other 3 ladies wrapped her body in a sheet. Fearing to let their mistress be touched by unworthy hands, forced themselves to do so, and carried her remains into the nearby chapel. Similarly, at Catherine Howard's execution in 1542, Eustace Chapuis acknowledged briefly the presence of her women. After the Queen was beheaded, her body had been covered with a black cloak, and her ladies took it away. After their executions, there was no mourning period at court. As Chapuis reports, in the days after Catherine's execution, Henry was reportedly in better spirits, even joyful, and with the ladies of the court participated in much feasting and banqueting, and made them great and hearty cheer. Would any of these ladies have dared to keep on their mourning apparel in the presence of the jovial king? This raises the question of how ladies and gentlewomen mourned publicly and how they might have mourned more privately. The nature of the surviving source material is such that we can never know the depths of their inward feelings or emotions in mourning for these royal women. A few of them did, however, memorialize their mistress by telling stories, anecdotes, tales from their years together at court. George Wyatt, the grandson of poet and courtier Sir Thomas Wyatt, wrote his biography of Anne, Life of the Virtuous Christian and Renowned Queen Anne Boleyn, with the testimony of Anne Gainsford, the Queen's maid of honour. And as Wyatt described her, a lady that first attended on her both before and after she was queen, with whose house and mine there was then kindred and strict alliance. In the Acts and Monuments, the English martyrologist John Fox attributed his account of Anne Boleyn to the chief and principal of her waiting maids about her, and especially the Duchess of Richmond, Mary Howard, Anne's cousin and lady-in-waiting, as well as her silkwoman, Joan Wilkinson. In a brief treatise or chronicle of the most virtuous Lady Anne Boleyn, late Queen of England, William Latimer claimed to attain to the knowledge of those who did attend upon her highness in divers kinds of service. To corroborate his account, namely the Lord Borough, then Lord Chamberlain, Sir James Boleyn, Her Majesty's Chancellor and uncle, Sir Edward Bainton, her Vice-Chamberlain, and Mr. Udall, her Secretary. And Latimer would recall, nearly 30 years later, that we that did attend her Majesty must needs justly lament the sudden departing of so good a princess, so much so that their hearts might seem for sorrow to pine and melt away. What made these accounts so compelling to Wyatt, Fox, and Latimer, and what makes them compelling today, is that these women and men knew and served the Queen, and thus their testimony carried weight. Certainly the testimony of Anne's servants could have been distorted, speaking in hindsight, their words recorded in accounts often second or third hand. Such is the nature of memory, but without it, we would know very little of Henry VIII's second wife and queen. Her servants reminisced about her in private. Indeed, they kept her memory alive by sharing what they could remember of their mistress. Women are often obscured, hidden and even invisible in the written record, but the funerals and executions of Henry VIII's wives proves to be an exception, as ladies and gentlewomen were prominent figures and played a central role. However, the surviving source material is still fragmentary, meaning that the reader must navigate, as these women did, this conflict between social convention or performance, in what was expected of them, and genuine emotion, in their own individual innate feelings. Both publicly and privately, ladies and gentlewomen mourn the loss of their royal mistresses, demonstrating the practical, visual, symbolic, and emotional significance of their participation. Thank you for listening.